So what is a brand? A brand is a promise of quality and consistency. And if we look at a number of examples, we'll find that a brand, no matter where it is, and what industry it is pretty much all the same. If we look at McDonald's, for instance, no matter where we go in the world, we know what to expect when we see the golden arches. We don't even have to see the name McDonald's. All we need is to see the golden arches, and we know the quality of food. In terms of the quality of food, a Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac. You can go to Toronto, you can go to Los Angeles, you can go to Beijing. You can go anywhere in Europe, you can go to South America. A Big Mac is a Big Mac. So there's our quality and our consistency. Coke, which may be the biggest brand in the world in terms of recognition, the same thing. We see the bottle, and the bottle tells us what it is just by seeing that shape, that iconic shape. We see the logo, and we know what it is just by seeing the font that they use. It's the Coke font. So we know what to expect. We know what the taste is going to be like just by seeing those images of the brand. So there's the quality, and there's a consistency, and there's the image. A little closer to the music business would be Fender. There's the iconic headstock, which is instantly recognizable. Now, you see that headstock, you know it's a Fender. And you see the amplifiers, and we're talking back old vintage amplifiers, and they have a distinct Fender look, and there's that distinct Fender logo that you know exactly what it is. When CBS bought the company from Leo Fender in 1965, the brand started to go downhill. And by the late 1970s, the quality of Fender was in serious doubt, and they actually broke the brand, so to speak, by suddenly taking this iconic quality that everybody knew and really degrading it severely just in their build quality and electronics and whatever. And it wasn't until the mid-1980s that Fender was bought back by the executives and restored the company to its former quality. But it took time. Once you break a brand, it's very difficult to get back to where you were. With an artist, we have the same thing in that there's certainly a consistent quality that we come to expect, but there's also the image. So an artist is based around the sound and the image. And certainly with Madonna, we could see that, where her initial look was kind of street, and she had some things that looked like they're from a secondhand store. And then she went to her Like a Virgin stage, and then she went to Material Girl stage. So you can see that everywhere you look there was a change in her image, yet you always knew it was Madonna, no matter what. You can see the image change, but yet the essence of her always stayed. The sound certainly always stayed, even though that changed. If we look at the Beatles, the same thing. The Beatles changed their look and they changed their sound every record, but it wasn't that much that you didn't understand it was them the first time you heard them. You heard Sgt. Pepper's, and it didn't sound like the first album, but you still knew it was the Beatles. You didn't even have to think about it. Now, an example of an artist who broke his brand is Neil Young. Neil Young was a guy who played in a band first. He played in Buffalo Springfield, then Crosby, Stills and Nash & Young. Then he had a solo career, but it was very authentic rock. And then in the 80s, he did an electronic album, and it was called Trans. And he broke his brand because he had a huge following that knew him for one sound, and suddenly it was completely and totally different. The next album, he went back to being himself, but it took him 4 or 5 albums, 4 or 5 years to actually build up that audience that he lost. He broke his brand, and then he had to restore it again. Chris Cornell at Soundgarden is much the same. Chris Cornell, of course, was the lead singer of Soundgarden, and he was known for one type of sound. When he did his first solo album, he continued that sound, and he built up his audience. Now, what happened is he turned around and he did a more or less electronic album with Timbaland, and that broke his brand. And people were expecting one thing, and they got something else. So he had to go back to Soundgarden in order to restore his brand. So you can see how important your sound and your image are. Once you establish that, it's really difficult to change it. And if you do, you may in fact break that brand. Now, you can change it, but you can't do it so much that you lose the connection with your audience. In the case of, let's say, producers or engineers or people that aren't artists that have a specialty perhaps. If we look at Quincy Jones, we immediately think of jazz and we think of R&B and a very slick R&B. And we think of Brothers Johnson and, of course, Michael Jackson. And there's a certain sound that we think of that's connected with Quincy. On the other hand, if we think of Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who did Janet Jackson, we're thinking of something that's precise, that's new, that's slick but street at the same time. Now, if we think of Trevor Horn, for instance, who did Yes and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and so many of the great English acts during the 80s, Grace Jones is another one. We think of slick and English. There's a typical sound, a layered sound that's completely different. But that's the sound of Trevor Horn, so it's very easy to distinguish what he sounds like against everybody else. If we jump into the future, into the now, we have Dr. Luke and Max Martin, who of course have done Britney and Keisha, Katy Perry, and what we think of there is a very precise electronic top 40 type of sound. Once again, it's very difficult to think of them any differently, and that's because they've established that sound. And they don't have an image per se because you never see them, but they have a sound. So if you're a musician, a solo musician, if you're a producer, an engineer, then you would think of cultivating that, cultivating something that makes you special. Because in this case, it would be a sound, because that's what makes you stand out from the rest of the crowd. Now, when it comes to an image, there's really three pillars. The first is familiarity. People have to be familiar with you. Now, one of the main proponents of that is Amanda Palmer. And you may know of Amanda Palmer through her social media, through her TED Talks, through all the publicity that she's garnered from her Kickstarter campaign. But you probably don't know her music because she's familiar to people. She's especially familiar to her fans that really like her music, but everybody else knows her as a personality, but they're familiar with her, so they know her brand. The second pillar is likability. People have to like you or something about you. Now, it could be an attitude, it could be an image, it could be an irreverence that you have. So it doesn't necessarily have to be you, it could be something about you that people really like. For instance, with the Sex Pistols, way back when, they were irreverent. They're especially irreverent to their audience, and their audience loved that about them. So, in fact, they don't have to like you, but they can like your attitude. So that's important. One of those things is what you need when it comes to likability. The third pillar is similarity. And that means you have to represent your audience in a cause or a movement. Maybe what it is they like you because you're like them. A good example would be Taylor Swift. She is her audience. Her audience thinks of her as the girl down the street who's their best friend. So she represents them. They feel that she is them. On the other hand, Olympic female athletes have no similarity with the average American female. So in fact, they have a hard time building their brand awareness because the bodies that they have are unattainable to most American women. So they actually contradict a brand. So you have these three pillars that make a brand: familiarity, likability, and similarity. You don't need to have all three. You can get by with one, although it's rare. Usually you have to have at least two. But these are the three things that almost every brand has if you were to analyze them. Brand awareness is usually important because sometimes it differentiates between a superstar from a star, or a star from someone who wants it really badly but just never seems to get that big break. So what you should always be doing is thinking about the brand, thinking about the brand you're looking at, thinking about your brand. By becoming self-aware of brands in general, you'll be able to not only discover yours, but develop it as well.